Famous criminals Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker both came from families that wound up struggling to make ends meet during the Great Depression. United by a shared ambition for fame and fortune, the two became lovers and embarked on a crime spree. They held up stores and banks from Texas to Minnesota, gaining themselves wealth and notoriety, and bringing excitement and entertainment to the down-and-out people of America. They lived a fast and wild life on the wrong side of the law, and eventually, it caught up with them. Today, we're going to take a look at the timeline of Bonnie and Clyde's crime spree. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other historical outlaws you would like to hear about. Now, let's go to one lazy afternoon down Savannah Way. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker and Clyde Chestnut Barrow, yeah, his middle name was Chestnut, first met in early 1930. The 19-year-old Bonnie Parker was already married at the time, but her husband was in prison and they were estranged. The marriage did little to discourage her nascent romance with Clyde Barrow. In fact, the attraction between the two was so strong it survived a prison sentence he incurred shortly after they met. While he was doing the time, he even made a ring for her. You have to admit, that is kind of sweet. Only 21 years old, Clyde Barrow had already committed a long list of misdeeds. Just a few short weeks after meeting Bonnie, he was sentenced to a term at Eastham Prison Farm. It wasn't his first stay behind bars, and it wouldn't be his last. Already willing to do anything for him, Bonnie helped him escape by smuggling a gun inside the prison. Clyde did make it out, but he was quickly hunted down and thrown back in prison. He would remain in the pen for another 2 years, finally being paroled in 1932. Not surprisingly, prison didn't do much in the way of reforming Clyde. If anything, he came out an even more hardened criminal. Once he was released, he assembled a loosely affiliated band of outlaws who helped him rob banks, small stores, and gas stations. With the exception of Bonnie, the members of what came to be known as the Barrow Gang changed over time. Although mostly famous for robberies, the group is also believed to be responsible for a series of slayings in 1932. Victims included both police and civilians. The group was prolific, but not always successful. On one occasion, Bonnie even ended up in jail after an attempted robbery at a store in Texas. During her 2 months behind bars, Bonnie wrote poetry to pass the time. However, like Clyde, she wasn't rehabilitated one bit. Upon release, she returned to Clyde and back to her infamous criminal lifestyle. Though primarily remembered for all the banks they robbed, the story of the Barrow Gang took a bloody detour in April of 1932. One of the group's members had shot and killed a Texas jeweler named John Butcher while attempting to rob his store. Butcher's wife was an eyewitness, and when questioned by the police, she identified Clyde Barrow as one of the culprits. The violence continued into the summer of 1932. While visiting Oklahoma, Clyde and an associate named Raymond Hamilton were approached by a sheriff and his deputy. According to news reports, Barrow and Hamilton opened fire without warning. The sheriff was killed and the deputy was wounded. Over the next 2 years, the Barrow Gang would continue to commit a string of brutal acts against officers of the law. Thankfully, these confrontations weren't always deadly. In fact, Bonnie and Clyde were just as likely to take a policeman alive as they were to take one out. By 1933, the Barrow Gang was becoming well known. Between just the months of April and July of that year, they were involved in several serious standoffs with the law. In early April, Clyde's brother Buck and sister-in-law Blanche joined the gang, and the group laid low in an apartment in Joplin, Missouri. However, on April 13th, police located and surrounded the unit. As usual, Bonnie and Clyde chose to shoot their way out. 2 police officers were killed during their escape. In July of '33, the gang went to Platte City, Missouri, where they tried to keep a low profile. However, that proved difficult in the small town. Blanche later recalled that everyone seemed to act as though she might open fire on them at any minute. When the police inevitably knocked on their front door, a woman's voice told them that she would open it as soon as she was dressed. It's unknown if that voice belonged to Bonnie or Blanche, but it doesn't matter. A moment later, the gang opened fire on the squad of officers. The entire Barrow gang escaped, although Blanche and Buck were injured. Living as a fugitive meant having to be prepared to flee a location quickly, even if valuable objects were left behind. When Bonnie and Clyde fled one of their Joplin hideouts, police found rolls of undeveloped film and Bonnie's handwritten poems. A local paper published the photos, which only made the couple more famous and stoked the public's image of them as rebellious but romantic lovers. Bonnie and Clyde were not skittish about ending anyone who stood in their way, whether it was a cop or a civilian. On the other hand, they weren't bloodthirsty either. The gang would often take hostages and later release them safely. Two such hostages were an undertaker named H.D. Darby and a woman named Sophie Stone. Darby and Stone were abducted when Bonnie and Clyde commandeered their car in Louisiana. At first, the outlaws were rough with the captives, but they quickly softened their attitude. By the time they dropped the terrified couple off in Arkansas, Clyde was feeling so apologetic he offered them $5 for their troubles and even invited the undertaker to embalm him when he died. When you're always on the run from the fuzz, you spend a lot of time in your car making quick getaways. Dangerous driving, as your auto insurance provider will tell you, makes a crash inevitable, and it finally happened to Bonnie and Clyde in the summer of 1933. Clyde was driving when the car went off the road. Everyone inside was injured. According to Blanche's later recollections, Bonnie suffered severe burns and had cuts on her leg, right arm, and face. His chin was said to be skinned to the bone, and her chest was caved in, although luckily no ribs were broken. The whole gang thought she would be dead by morning. Amazingly, Bonnie pulled through and survived the injuries, but she never fully recovered from them. Just a few short days after they survived a raid in Platte City, Missouri, the gang found themselves facing down the police once again. Bonnie, Clyde, Blanche, and Buck had fled to Iowa, where they sought refuge at a closed amusement park. When the police inevitably caught up with the foursome, Bonnie and Clyde managed to escape with their lives. Buck and Blanche, however, were not so lucky. The police fired on Buck, hitting him several times. Blanche opted to stay with her husband and was arrested. Buck didn't make it. He died at the hospital. Over the course of the crime spree, several of Bonnie and Clyde's associates were captured by the police. In fact, Raymond Hamilton, who had helped Clyde dispose of a sheriff in Oklahoma in 1932, was himself in custody at Eastham. Having served time at the same facility several years earlier, Clyde was familiar with their procedures. So, on January 16, 1934, Bonnie and Clyde were able to free Hamilton and several other inmates by firing upon the prison guards in a field. On April 2, 1934, everything changed. Bonnie and Clyde, whose exploits had made them popular with the public at large, killed two Texas police officers who had approached their car. That crime quickly turned public opinion against the outlaw couple. No longer were they seen as rebellious, romantic anti-heroes. Instead, the cold-bloodedness of the incident cast the pair in a much darker light. Bonnie and Clyde finally met their fate on a stretch of highway in rural Louisiana. Having received a tip as to the couple's whereabouts and likely destination, the police were able to set up an ambush. 6 officers from 3 different law enforcement agencies were involved. They waited for Bonnie and Clyde at the side of the road and opened fire on their car as it passed. Fred Hamer, one of the lawmen who was on the scene that day, reported that despite the fact both were clutching their sidearms when the trap was sprung, neither Clyde nor Bonnie was able to get off even a single shot. Footage taken that day shows that the car was hit by 112 bullets, about a quarter of which are believed to have hit the infamous couple. The coroner would ultimately report that Clyde had 17 bullet wounds and Bonnie had 26. A crowd quickly gathered at the scene as the news spread. Bonnie and Clyde were set on by souvenir seekers who ghoulishly cut locks of hair and bits of clothing from them. The dramatic end of Bonnie and Clyde was front-page news from coast to coast. Both were returned to Texas for burial. Spectators lined up outside the funeral homes by the thousands, merely to get a glimpse of the notorious bandits. Sadly, though they were virtually inseparable in life, Bonnie and Clyde's families decided to bury them separately. Approximately 20,000 people showed up to see Bonnie laid to rest. As one of the most infamous outlaw couples of all time, Bonnie and Clyde remain legendary in the annals of American crime and pop culture. They've been the subject of numerous books, including one by Blanche Barrow herself, songs, including ones by Mel Torme and Merle Haggard, and movies, including 1967's Bonnie and Clyde, starring Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty, as well as Netflix's 2019 film The Highwaymen. More tellingly, Bonnie and Clyde's very name survive in the idiomatic phrase modern-day Bonnie and Clyde, which is still used to refer to couples who operate together as criminals. So what do you think? What's your take on Bonnie and Clyde, heroes or sociopaths? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.